The gray waters of the Pacific churned beneath an overcast sky on that June morning in 1942. Lieutenant Commander James Caldwell stood on the flight deck of the USS Yorktown, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he watched the horizon. The carrier had survived the Battle of Coral Sea just weeks earlier, patched together with determination and steel in a Pearl Harbor dry dock that worked around the clock. Now, barely seaworthy by peacetime standards, she sailed toward what would become one of the most crucial naval battles in history. The ship's air group had been hastily reassembled. Young pilots, some with barely 30 hours of carrier landing experience, found themselves thrust into a conflict that would demand every ounce of courage they possessed. The mechanics worked through the night, their hands black with grease, coaxing life from engines that had seen too much action too soon. Everyone aboard knew the Japanese fleet was out there somewhere, hunting for them with the same intensity they hunted for it. If you're fascinated by real stories of courage and historical battles that changed the course of history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories to life. Caldwell had flown combat missions since the war began. His logbook told a story of close calls and narrow escapes, but nothing had prepared him for the intelligence briefing that morning. The Yorktown, along with the Enterprise and Hornet, faced a Japanese carrier force that outnumbered them significantly. The enemy had 4 fleet carriers, each one a proven weapon of war that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. The American commanders knew they needed every advantage they could muster, and surprise was their only real weapon. The dawn brought news that would set the day's events into motion. A Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80, had spotted the Japanese fleet 200 miles to the northwest. The report crackled through the radio room, and within minutes, Admiral Fletcher ordered the strike launched. The flight deck erupted into controlled chaos as crews rushed to arm and fuel the waiting aircraft. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters rolled toward the catapults, their engines roaring to life in a symphony of American industrial might. Sarah Mitchell sat in the radio room deep within the ship, her headset pressed tight against her ears. She was one of only 3 women aboard, a radio specialist whose job was to monitor enemy transmissions and relay critical intelligence. The Navy had reluctantly begun accepting women in technical roles, and Sarah had fought hard for her position. Now, as she listened to the coded Japanese transmissions, she knew her work could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. Her fingers flew across the decoding sheets, translating the enemy's communications into actionable intelligence. The first wave of American aircraft launched into the morning sky, their formation breaking apart as they climbed for altitude. Caldwell led his squadron of Wildcat fighters, designated to provide cover for the vulnerable torpedo bombers below. He knew the odds. The Japanese Zero fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. His Wildcats were tough and could take punishment, but in a dogfight, they were outmatched. The key was to use tactics, teamwork, and a healthy dose of aggression. Below him, the torpedo squadron skimmed the wavetops, their obsolete devastators struggling to maintain formation. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led them, a man whose determination bordered on obsession. He had drilled his men relentlessly, knowing that their slow, low approach made them sitting ducks for enemy fighters. But if they could get their torpedoes into the water near a carrier, they might cripple the Japanese fleet's ability to launch aircraft. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. The radio crackled with terse communications. Scout planes reported the Japanese carriers turning into the wind, preparing to launch their own strike against the American fleet. Time compressed into a deadly race. Whoever got their aircraft into the air first, whoever struck the decisive blow, would likely determine the battle's outcome. The tension aboard the Yorktown became palpable as reports filtered through the ship's communication systems. Sarah decoded another transmission, this one detailing Japanese fighter deployments. She immediately relayed it to the bridge where Admiral Fletcher and his staff studied the tactical situation. The Japanese had launched a massive strike against what they believed was only one American carrier. They didn't know 3 carriers waited for them, and that miscalculation would prove costly. But first, the American strike had to succeed. Caldwell's squadron reached the reported position of the Japanese fleet, but the ocean below remained empty. Clouds obscured visibility, and fuel gauges began their relentless countdown. The pilots scanned the horizon anxiously, knowing they had limited time before they would need to turn back or ditch in the ocean. Then, through a break in the clouds, someone spotted them. 4 carriers steaming in a box formation surrounded by cruisers and destroyers, their decks crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled. The sight electrified every pilot. This was what they had trained for, what they had sailed thousands of miles to accomplish, but between them and their targets swarmed dozens of Zero fighters, already climbing to intercept. Caldwell keyed his microphone, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He ordered his fighters to engage the Zeros, to draw them away from the torpedo bombers that were beginning their attack runs. What happened next unfolded with brutal clarity. The Devastators, slow and vulnerable, descended toward the carriers, while Zeros swarmed them like angry hornets. Caldwell's Wildcats dove into the melee, their .50 caliber machine guns blazing, the sky filled with tracers, smoke, and the screams of dying men over the radio. One by one, the torpedo bombers fell, shot down before they could release their weapons. Waldron's entire squadron was annihilated, 15 aircraft and their 30 crew members lost in a matter of minutes. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level, focusing on the torpedo threat. High above, the American dive bombers arrived unnoticed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had led his squadron on a gamble following a Japanese destroyer that was racing to rejoin the fleet. Now, at 14,000 feet, he looked down at a sight that would change the course of the war. 3 Japanese carriers sat below him, their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft. They were at their most vulnerable, caught in the act of launching their strike. McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, and his squadron followed. The next 6 minutes would become the most decisive of the Pacific War. Sarah heard the results before anyone else aboard the Yorktown. The Japanese radio transmissions dissolved into panic and confusion. She quickly translated what she could, her hand shaking as she realized what was happening. 3 carriers hit, burning, explosions ripping through their hangar decks. She rushed the information to the bridge, where officers struggled to believe the news. It seemed too good to be true, but the battle was far from over. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, had escaped the initial attack. Her captain, enraged by the destruction of his sister ships, immediately launched a strike against the Yorktown. The American carrier had been spotted, and now Japanese bombers and torpedo planes were racing toward her with vengeance in their hearts. The Yorktown's radar picked up the incoming strike at 46 miles. The carrier's air group was still returning from their attack, fuel running dangerously low. The ship's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, ordered all available fighters launched immediately. The remaining Wildcats roared off the deck, climbing desperately to intercept the incoming raid. Anti-aircraft crews rushed to their stations, loading ammunition and preparing for the onslaught they knew was coming. Caldwell's squadron was among those scrambled to intercept. Exhausted from the earlier fight, low on fuel and ammunition, they turned toward the incoming threat. Through his canopy, Caldwell could see them coming. 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters flying in tight formation at 12,000 feet. His radio operator called out positions and altitudes, her voice steady despite the chaos. The Wildcats tore into the formation, their machine guns ripping through the enemy bombers. Several Japanese aircraft fell in flames, but the rest pressed on with fanatical determination. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracers. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, a cacophony of destruction that shook the very air. Then came the moment that would define the Yorktown's legend. The ship's captain ordered a hard turn to port, trying to comb the torpedo tracks that were surely coming. But these were dive bombers, not torpedo planes, and they came from above. The first bomb struck the flight deck, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. The blast killed dozens instantly and started fires that spread through 3 decks. A second bomb hit moments later, then a third. Sarah felt the ship shudder beneath her feet. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the radio room into darkness broken only by emergency lighting. Smoke began filtering through the ventilation system. She stayed at her post, headset still on, monitoring enemy communications even as damage control parties rushed past her position. The training kicked in, overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze her. The Yorktown listed to port as water flooded her lower compartments. Fires raged out of control in the hangar deck. Captain Buckmaster assessed the damage and made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered abandon ship. The crew had fought magnificently, but the carrier appeared doomed. As sailors began filing onto the flight deck, preparing to leave their ship, many wept openly. This vessel had become their home, and leaving her felt like abandoning a family member. But even as the evacuation proceeded, damage control teams refused to give up. Chief Petty Officer Harold Davis led a group of volunteers back into the smoke-filled compartments, fighting fires and shoring up bulkheads. They worked with a desperate intensity, knowing that every minute they bought might save their ship. Slowly, incredibly, they began to gain control. The fires were contained, the flooding stopped, the list corrected. By late afternoon, the Yorktown still floated. Captain Buckmaster returned aboard with a salvage crew determined to save his ship. They worked through the night, pumping water, fighting spot fires, restoring power to critical systems. The carrier began to show signs of life again. It seemed miraculous, impossible, yet there she was, damaged but defiant. Sarah returned to her post as well, part of the skeleton crew that remained aboard. She resumed monitoring enemy transmissions, providing intelligence that would prove crucial in the coming hours. The Japanese had lost 3 carriers, but the Hiryu remained operational and dangerous. American dive bombers found her that evening and sent her to the bottom with the same devastating precision they had shown that morning. The next morning brought new challenges. A Japanese submarine, the I-168, had been stalking the wounded Yorktown. At dawn, her captain spotted the carrier under tow, protected by a ring of destroyers. He maneuvered into position and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck the Yorktown and 2 more hit the destroyer Hammond, which was tied alongside, providing power and pumping support. The Hammond broke in half and sank in 4 minutes, taking 80 of her crew with her. The Yorktown absorbed the torpedo hits but remained afloat, though listing heavily once more. The salvage crew abandoned ship again, this time for good. Captain Buckmaster stood on the bridge, refusing to leave until the last man was off. When he finally stepped onto the destroyer that would carry him away, he saluted his ship, tears streaming down his face. The Yorktown remained afloat through the night, a ghost ship drifting on the Pacific swells. Salvage crews prepared to return at dawn, unwilling to accept her loss. But the damage was too severe, the flooding too extensive. At 5 a.m. on June 7th, the carrier rolled onto her port side and slipped beneath the waves. She took with her the hopes of those who had fought so hard to save her, but her sacrifice had already ensured American victory. Caldwell survived the battle, as did Sarah Mitchell and countless others whose courage had turned the tide of the Pacific War. In the months and years that followed, they would fight other battles, face other dangers, but none would forget the 4 days in June when a damaged carrier and her determined crew had helped defeat the most powerful naval force Japan could assemble. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups. The loss crippled their offensive capability and shifted the strategic initiative to the United States. The Yorktown, though lost, had played a crucial role in that victory. Her aircraft had helped sink 3 enemy carriers, and her presence had forced the Japanese to divide their attention and resources. Even in her final hours, she had drawn the enemy submarine away from the other American carriers, protecting them for the battles to come. In the decades since, military historians have studied the battle exhaustively, analyzing every decision, every tactic, every moment of courage and sacrifice. They have recognized that victory came not from superior equipment or numbers, but from the determination of individuals who refused to accept defeat. Young pilots who flew obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds, sailors who stayed at their posts even as their ship burned beneath them. Radio operators who decoded enemy messages while explosions rocked the hull around them. Sarah Mitchell returned home after the war and never spoke publicly about her role in the battle. She had signed secrecy agreements that remained in force for decades, and by the time they were declassified, she had built a different life far from the military. But her family found her commendations and medals after she passed away, along with a personal letter from Admiral Nimitz thanking her for intelligence work that had proven invaluable during critical moments of the battle. Caldwell continued flying fighters throughout the war, eventually commanding a squadron aboard the new USS Yorktown CV-10, named in honor of the carrier lost at Midway. He retired as a captain in 1962, exactly 20 years after the battle that had defined his life. In his later years, he spoke at schools and veteran gatherings, always emphasizing the same message. Victory came from ordinary people doing extraordinary things when their country needed them most. The wreck of the Yorktown was discovered in 1998, resting upright on the ocean floor 3 miles down. The expedition that found her captured haunting images of the flight deck where so many brave men had launched into combat. The anti-aircraft guns still pointed skyward, frozen in their final act of defiance. The ship had become a war grave, a monument to sacrifice that would remain undisturbed in the depths. For the survivors who gathered each year to remember, the Yorktown represented more than just a ship. She embodied the spirit of a generation that had faced an existential threat and refused to yield. They had been young mostly, untested and uncertain, thrust into a conflict that demanded everything they had to give. Many had not survived. Those who did carried the memories of those lost comrades for the rest of their lives. The tactical decisions made during those 4 days in June continue to be studied at military academies worldwide. The aggressive use of aircraft carriers as offensive weapons, the coordination of multi-carrier task forces, the integration of intelligence into real-time tactical decisions, all became templates for naval warfare that remain relevant today. But beyond the tactical lessons, the battle demonstrated something more fundamental about human nature and national character. When the odds seemed insurmountable, when logic suggested withdrawal or surrender, the men and women of the Yorktown and her sister ships chose to fight. They improvised, adapted, and overcame challenges that would have broken lesser spirits. The carrier that should have spent months in dry dock went into battle held together by determination and welding. The air group that needed weeks of training flew into combat with barely enough practice to land on a carrier deck. The damage control parties that should have abandoned ship stayed and fought fires until their ship was saved, not once, but twice. Chief Davis, who led the damage control efforts that kept the Yorktown afloat after the first attack, received the Navy Cross for his actions. He downplayed his role, insisting he had only done what any sailor would do for his ship. But his leadership had inspired others to attempt the impossible, and their collective effort had given the carrier precious extra hours of life. Those hours allowed more aircraft to land safely, more intelligence to be gathered, more coordination with the other carriers in the task force. The destroyer crews that rescued Yorktown's sailors after she was torpedoed, the second time, performed feats of seamanship that bordered on the miraculous. They maneuvered alongside the listing carrier in heavy swells, took aboard hundreds of men, then had to scatter when the submarine was detected nearby. The Hammond paid the ultimate price for her assistance, but her sacrifice saved countless Yorktown sailors who would have gone down with the carrier. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, American newspapers celebrated the victory with banner headlines. The public, starved for good news after 6 months of defeat and retreat, embraced the story of Midway as proof that the tide had turned. But the full details remained classified for years. The code breaking that had enabled the ambush, the desperate gambles that had paid off, the terrible losses suffered by the torpedo squadrons, all of this remained secret until long after the war ended. When the complete story finally emerged, it only deepened respect for what had been accomplished. The victory had not been inevitable or even likely. It had resulted from a combination of courage, skill, and fortune that could easily have gone the other way. If the dive bombers had not found the Japanese carriers at that precise moment, if the torpedo squadrons had not drawn the enemy fighters down to sea level, if any one of a dozen critical decisions had gone differently, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The families of the men who died at Midway received telegrams in the weeks after the battle. The standard notification gave no details beyond the fact of death in action. Mothers and wives across America mourned sons and husbands lost in a battle they knew nothing about, in a place most had never heard of. Only later would they learn that their loved ones had helped secure a victory that changed the course of history. It was small comfort for their loss, but it gave meaning to sacrifice that might otherwise have seemed pointless. In small towns across the country, families gathered to remember their lost sons. Mary Caldwell, no relation to the lieutenant commander, received word that her husband Robert had been killed when his Devastator went down during the torpedo attack. She was 23 years old with a 2-year-old daughter who would never remember her father. Mary kept Robert's last letter, written just days before the battle, in which he expressed love for his family and confidence in his squadron. He had written about the beauty of the Pacific sunsets, the camaraderie among his fellow pilots, and his determination to do his duty. The letter became her most treasured possession. In Norfolk, Virginia, the wife of a Yorktown machinist mate received notification that her husband was missing in action. She refused to believe he was gone, clinging to hope that he had somehow survived. Weeks later, she learned he had been one of the men rescued by destroyers after the final torpedo attack. He returned home months later, gaunt and haunted by what he had witnessed, but alive. The reunion brought tears of joy, but also marked the beginning of a long struggle as he tried to reconcile the horrors he had experienced with the normalcy of civilian life. The chaplain aboard the Yorktown, Commander Frank Latta, had conducted burial services at sea for those killed in the initial Japanese attack. Standing on the tilted deck of the damaged carrier, he had spoken words of comfort and commitment over the shrouded bodies before they slipped into the Pacific. The memory of those young faces, peaceful in death, would stay with him for the rest of his life. After the war, he made it his mission to visit the families of every man he had committed to the deep, sharing what he could about their final moments and the courage they had shown. The medical staff aboard the Yorktown had worked under conditions that would have challenged the best-equipped hospital. Dr. Samuel Meyer and his corpsmen treated dozens of wounded men in a makeshift aid station set up in a passageway below decks. With the ship's power failing and smoke making it difficult to breathe, they performed triage, administered morphine, and did what they could to stabilize the critically injured. When the order came to abandon ship, Meyer insisted on staying until every wounded man who could be moved had been evacuated. He personally carried 3 men up ladder wells to the flight deck, returning each time for another casualty until his own strength was nearly exhausted. One of the wounded was Seaman First Class Thomas Rivera, a 19-year-old from Texas who had been stationed at an anti-aircraft gun when a bomb exploded nearby. Shrapnel had torn through his left leg and side, and he had lost consciousness from blood loss. When he woke in the aid station, Dr. Meyer was there, telling him he was going to make it, that he was going home. Rivera would spend a year in hospitals, enduring multiple surgeries and learning to walk again. But he did go home, and he lived a long life, always crediting Dr. Meyer with saving him not just physically, but by giving him hope when he needed it most. The destroyer captains who rescued Yorktown's crew displayed seamanship of the highest order. Captain True of the Hammond brought his ship alongside the listing carrier, using his engines to maintain position in heavy swells while hundreds of men scrambled across. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, risking collision that could have sunk both vessels. But True never hesitated, knowing that every minute counted. When his own ship was struck by torpedoes the next day, he went down with her, refusing to leave until he was certain all survivors had gotten clear. His body was never recovered. The executive officer of the Yorktown, Commander Dixie Kiefer, had been everywhere during the battle, coordinating damage control, encouraging the crew, making critical decisions when communications with the captain were interrupted. During the first attack, a bomb fragment had grazed his skull, leaving him bleeding and dazed. He refused medical attention, wrapping a bandage around his head and continuing to direct operations. His leadership during those critical hours had been essential to saving the ship after the first attack. When the carrier finally went down, Kiefer was among the last to leave, helping to lower wounded men into life rafts. He would go on to command his own carrier later in the war, bringing the lessons of Midway to every decision he made. The stories of near misses and incredible fortune abounded. One pilot, Ensign George Gay, was the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Every other aircraft in his squadron had been shot down, 15 planes and 29 men lost in less than 10 minutes. Gay's torpedo failed to hit, and his Devastator was immediately set upon by Zeros. Hit multiple times, the plane crashed into the ocean. Gay survived the impact, hiding under a seat cushion while Japanese ships passed within yards of his position. He watched the entire battle unfold from the water, witnessing the dive bomber attacks that destroyed the Japanese carriers. After floating for hours, he was finally rescued by a Navy seaplane. His eyewitness account provided invaluable intelligence about the battle and confirmation of the damage inflicted on the enemy. The dive bomber pilots, who actually sank the carriers, experienced a mix of exhilaration and terror during their attacks. Lieutenant Richard Best led his section in the attack on the Akagi, Japan's flagship carrier. Diving from 14,000 feet, he watched his altimeter unwind while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around him. Tracers arced past his canopy. Shells burst in black puffs, and the carrier below seemed to grow larger by the second. At 1,500 feet, he released his bomb and pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. Behind him, his rear gunner reported a direct hit amidships. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck where fully fueled aircraft waited, touching off a catastrophic explosion that would doom the carrier. Best's wingman, Lieutenant Edwin Kroger, targeted the same carrier but adjusted his aim point when he saw Best's bomb hit. His 1,000-pound bomb struck further aft, adding to the devastation. Within minutes, the Akagi was a burning wreck, her flight deck blown apart, fires raging out of control. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the strike on Pearl Harbor, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser, watching helplessly as his carriers burned. Meanwhile, other dive bomber sections attacked the Kaga and Soryu. Both carriers suffered multiple bomb hits that started uncontrollable fires. The scene was repeated 3 times in 6 minutes. 3 fleet carriers transformed from powerful weapons of war into burning hulks. Japanese damage control parties fought bravely but were overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. Secondary explosions rocked the ships as aviation fuel and ordnance cooked off. Men jumped overboard to escape the flames, only to face the horror of burning oil spreading across the water's surface. The Japanese destroyer crews that rescued survivors from the burning carriers witnessed scenes that would haunt them forever. Men with terrible burns, uniforms melted to their skin, begged for water. Officers who had lost their entire commands wept openly, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. The carriers settled slowly, taking hours to finally slip beneath the waves. As they went down, some sailors stood at attention on the tilting decks, saluting their flags as their ships died. The Hiryu's brief survival offered the Japanese one last chance to turn the battle. Her aircraft had damaged the Yorktown severely, and for a few hours it seemed she might escape to fight another day. But American search planes found her in late afternoon, and dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown delivered the same devastating attack that had destroyed her sisters. Hit by 4 bombs, the Hiryu caught fire and was soon beyond saving. Her captain, choosing death over surrender, went down with his ship when she was scuttled the following morning. The cost of victory was high. The Yorktown lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Over 300 American airmen and sailors had been killed. Dozens of aircraft had been lost. But the Japanese had suffered catastrophic losses. 4 fleet carriers gone, along with over 3,000 officers and men. The cream of Japan's naval aviation, pilots who had trained for years and fought from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, were dead. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted decisively. In the weeks after Midway, American codebreakers continued monitoring Japanese communications. The intercepts revealed the full extent of enemy shock and confusion. Japanese naval headquarters struggled to explain how they had suffered such devastating defeat. Recriminations flew between commanders. The operation's planning flaws, the overconfidence, the dispersion of forces, all of it was dissected and debated. But no amount of analysis could change what had happened. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and overall commander at Midway, took the defeat personally. He had warned before the war that Japan could not defeat America in a protracted conflict. Midway proved him right. The industrial and demographic advantages the United States possessed would, given time, prove overwhelming. Japan's only hope had been a quick, decisive victory that would force America to negotiate. That hope died in the waters off Midway Atoll. For the American public, Midway provided the first clear evidence that the war could be won. After 6 months of defeat and retreat, finally there was victory. The boost to morale was incalculable. War bond drives saw increased participation. Factory workers redoubled their efforts. Young men lined up at recruiting stations. The belief that sacrifice and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds became a defining characteristic of the American war effort. The survivors of the Yorktown found themselves celebrated as heroes when they returned home. They were featured in newsreels, interviewed for newspapers, asked to speak at war bond rallies. Many felt uncomfortable with the attention, insisting they had only done their jobs, that the real heroes were the ones who hadn't come back. But they understood the importance of maintaining public morale and accepted their role as representatives of all those who served. Sarah Mitchell returned to her family in Michigan, resuming the life she had left when she volunteered for the Navy. She worked in a defense plant, building the aircraft that would eventually help win the war. She married after the war ended, raised 3 children, and lived to see her grandchildren grow up. Only near the end of her life did she begin to talk about her experiences aboard the Yorktown, and even then, she shared only what had been declassified. Some secrets she took to her grave, keeping faith with the oath she had sworn decades earlier. James Caldwell's post-Midway career included command of fighter squadrons in multiple campaigns. He shot down 8 Japanese aircraft during the war, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Navy Cross. But he always said his most important contribution had been at Midway, when his squadron's desperate fight against the Zeros had helped protect the dive bombers that won the battle. He never forgot the pilots who didn't make it back that day, men he had trained with, flown with, considered brothers. Their loss shaped the rest of his life, driving him to honor their sacrifice through his own continued service. The Yorktown's bell, salvaged from the wreck in 1998, now resides in the Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in South Carolina. Visitors can see it there, a tangible connection to the ship and her crew. The bell bears the marks of its time underwater, corroded and worn, but still recognizable as the instrument that called sailors to their stations, that marked the watches, that rang in celebration and in mourning. Each year, the number of Midway veterans who can attend the reunions grows smaller. Time takes its inevitable toll, and soon there will be none left who can speak from personal experience about those 4 days in June. But their story has been preserved in countless books, documentaries, and memorials. The lessons they taught through their actions continue to resonate with new generations facing their own challenges. The young ensign who had never made a carrier landing before Midway, who went on to become an ace with 8 kills, eventually became an admiral himself. He commanded carrier groups during the Cold War, always crediting his Midway experience as the foundation of everything he later accomplished. The fear he felt on that first combat mission never completely left him, but he learned to control it, to use it as fuel for the focus and determination that combat demanded. Sarah Mitchell's daughter donated her mother's papers to the National Archives, where researchers discovered details about the intelligence work that had supported the battle. The intercepts Sarah had decoded provided real-time updates on Japanese damage assessments, confirmation of which carriers had been hit, and warnings about the Hiryu strike being launched. This information had helped Admiral Fletcher make informed decisions at crucial moments, contributing to the overall victory in ways that went unrecognized for decades. The mechanics who worked on Yorktown's aircraft often spoke of the impossible repair jobs they had accomplished. Engines that should have been replaced were coaxed back to life with improvised parts and sheer, stubborn refusal to accept failure. Airframes that should have been scrapped were patched and returned to service. Every aircraft that flew from the Yorktown's deck represented hours of backbreaking labor by men who rarely received recognition but whose work was absolutely essential to victory. The stories of individual heroism could fill volumes. The pilot who landed his damaged Wildcat with one wheel up deliberately ground looping on the deck to avoid hitting other aircraft. The gunner who stayed at his anti-aircraft mount even after being wounded, continuing to fire until he collapsed from blood loss. The engineer who entered a flooded compartment to secure a watertight door, knowing he might not make it back out. Each act of courage, multiplied across hundreds of individuals, created the collective achievement that was the Battle of Midway. In the ship's final moments, as she rolled over and began her journey to the ocean floor, Observers on nearby destroyers reported seeing her battle flag still flying from the mast. Whether this was actually true or a comforting myth created in the aftermath is unclear, but the image captured something essential about the Yorktown and her crew. They had fought with every resource at their disposal, held nothing back, and gone down with colors flying. It was a fitting end for a ship that had given everything in service to her country. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japan lost not just 4 carriers, but the core of their experienced naval air groups. The pilots who died at Midway represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. The Japanese training system, never robust enough to sustain heavy losses, could not produce replacements of equal quality. From Midway onward, the average skill level of Japanese naval aviators steadily declined while American pilot quality improved. The American shipbuilding industry, already mobilizing for war production, began turning out new carriers at an astounding rate. The Essex-class fleet carriers would eventually number more than 20, each one larger and more capable than the Yorktown. The production of aircraft accelerated as well, with new designs like the Hellcat fighter specifically created to counter the Zero. Within 2 years of Midway, American material superiority would become overwhelming, but the victory at Midway bought the time needed to build that advantage. For the sailors who survived the Yorktown's sinking, the experience created bonds that lasted a lifetime. They had shared something profound, a trial by fire that revealed what each man was made of. The reunion associations they formed after the war became second families, places where they could talk about things that civilians could not understand. The shared trauma and triumph of Midway gave them a common language, a mutual respect that transcended differences in rank or background. The Japanese submarine commander who sank the Yorktown, Commander Tanabe, survived the war and in later years expressed regret about his role in the carrier's loss. He recognized that he had destroyed a noble ship, and he respected the courage of her crew who had fought so hard to save her. This mutual respect between former enemies, emerging in the post-war years, helped heal some of the wounds left by the conflict. It demonstrated that honor and courage exist on both sides of any war, even as it remains necessary to fight when fundamental values are at stake. The wreck site of the Yorktown has been designated a war grave, protected by international treaty from salvage or disturbance. The ship rests in darkness 3 miles below the surface, beyond the reach of sunlight and cold silence broken only by the slow movement of deep ocean currents. Fish swim through passageways where sailors once walked. Coral grows on steel that was forged in American foundries and shaped by American hands. The carrier has become part of the ocean ecosystem, a massive artificial reef that will endure for centuries. Remote-operated vehicles have explored the wreck extensively, documenting her condition and creating detailed maps of the debris field. These expeditions have recovered artifacts with family connections, returning them to the descendants of Yorktown sailors. A hat, a pair of glasses, a personal item that survived the sinking becomes a treasured link to a father or grandfather who served aboard the carrier. These small objects carry emotional weight far beyond their material value, connecting the present to that crucial moment in history. The lessons of Midway remain relevant in an age of missiles and drones, cyber warfare, and space-based sensors. The fundamental principles, the aggressive use of intelligence, the concentration of force at the decisive point, the importance of training and morale, these transcend specific technologies or tactics. Modern naval officers study Midway not to replicate specific maneuvers, but to understand how to think about complex tactical problems under conditions of uncertainty and danger. The courage demonstrated by Yorktown's crew has inspired countless individuals facing their own battles, both military and civilian. Cancer patients have drawn strength from reading about sailors who refused to give up even when their ship was sinking. Entrepreneurs facing business failure have found encouragement in stories of mechanics who improvised solutions to impossible problems. Teachers working in underfunded schools have seen parallels in doing more with less, achieving excellence despite inadequate resources. The story resonates because it speaks to universal human experiences, the struggle against overwhelming odds, the refusal to accept defeat, the power of teamwork and determination. As the last witnesses to these events pass into history, the responsibility for remembering falls to subsequent generations. Museums preserve the artifacts and tell the stories. Historians continue researching, finding new details in declassified documents and personal papers donated to archives. Documentary filmmakers use modern technology to bring the battle to life for audiences who have no memory of World War II. Each of these efforts helps ensure that the sacrifice of the Yorktown and her crew will not be forgotten. The carrier's legacy extends beyond her role in one battle. She represented a type of ship that revolutionized naval warfare, projecting power hundreds of miles from the vessel itself through aircraft. The lessons learned operating the Yorktown informed the design and tactics of every carrier that followed. Her crew included men who would go on to command carrier groups, to lead naval aviation, to shape the post-war Navy into the most powerful maritime force the world has ever seen. The experience gained aboard the Yorktown, both in victory and defeat, proved invaluable in the long struggle ahead. Standing on the deck of the modern USS Yorktown, the museum ship permanently moored in Charleston Harbor, visitors can imagine what it must have been like on that June morning in 1942. The flight deck stretches nearly 900 feet, vast, yet somehow inadequate for the demands placed upon it. The island's superstructure, the catapults, the arresting cables, all the complex machinery required to launch and recover aircraft at sea. Modern carriers are larger and more capable, but they still perform the same basic functions, still depend on the courage and skill of the men and women who serve aboard them. The sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the water where the Yorktown made her final dive. The ocean surface gives no hint of the drama that unfolded here 8 decades ago. The bombs and torpedoes, the burning ships and falling aircraft, the men who fought and died in service to their country. But beneath the waves, the carrier remains, a steel monument to courage and sacrifice, slowly returning to the elements from which she was forged. She rests in honored glory, her duty done, her story told, her legacy secure in the hearts of those who remember what she and her crew accomplished in freedom's cause.